I always start with a little bit of background, and your background is particularly interesting, so I want to go back to your childhood and just talk a little bit about growing up, your father, and the circumstances.
Well, I grew up in former Czechoslovakia. My father was a college professor. It was an agricultural college. My mother was a homekeeper, and my father was a scientist, but he had nothing to do, or not much, with chemistry, only as much as agriculture required.
But he was a chemist?
Not really. He wasn't a chemist at all. And I never thought I will become a chemist, let alone a scientist. That was completely foreign to me. I grew up as a regular kid, kicking ball on the street with others. I was bicycling and going swimming. And what I find not quite in line with me becoming later a scientist, that I was a very average student. I was, in mathematics, I was below average student. I didn't have much interest in school or studying. I remember that my parents tried me to take piano lessons that didn't last longer than 1 year. And up until 9th grade, I was very average, mediocre student. And I can account it for not very good teachers. And why I'm saying that is when I then went to real high school, everything changed suddenly, like with a strike of a magic stick. In Czechoslovakia, there was a very good network of specialized high schools. So after junior high, my parents had a choice to have me enrolled either at a regular high school, where I would be getting general education, or some specialized school where I could become either a chemist, an electrical engineer, or architect, or something like that. Or there were also specialized high school for nurses, which was graduates from those schools were equivalent to probably bachelor's degree here. Now, my father didn't want me to enroll in regular high school because, those were very difficult times. In the early 50s in Czechoslovakia, it was only very, very few years after change of government from a fully democratic government before 1948 to a communist dictatorship. And it was so that people who had intellectual background were not really in favor. I mean, you had to be from a working class to have access to everything, and because of my father's maybe few black marks in his file, he didn't believe that I will be actually able to enter university. So he wanted me, before I would even apply, to have already something in my hands, some professional training. And as I said, I was just a regular kid. Children are very impressionable. And I was pretty indoctrinated by the system, and I believed in the ideology, and I thought that my role would be best fulfilled if I go to the rural areas and become teacher of the underprivileged children. So I wanted to become a teacher of elementary school or something very in remote areas. Well, it didn't fly very well with my father, who was a scientist, and he said that I should choose from one of those more proper schools where I should get some practical education. and that if I won't be able to choose, then he will choose for me. And I really couldn't choose anything because I wasn't interested in very much in these things. The only thing I was interested in actually, which was more, intellectual, I was a very avid photographer. I was an amateur photographer. I used to make my prints in myself in the bathroom, dark room, which I created in the apartment where we lived. And that had maybe a little bit something to do with chemistry, but I didn't look at it from that point of view. I just like to take pictures and make them, but I didn't think about chemistry. But because my father was in agriculture and I was interested in photography, he thought that maybe chemistry should be the school. So he enrolled me in this high school specialized in chemistry. And I started to prosper very well. And I must say, with a little sarcasm, that I thank to my becoming eventually a chemist to the communist system. And why am I saying that? Because our teachers were very qualified, best teachers from the universities, and they were not allowed to teach at the universities because of their background and because they were bourgeois. So these technical high schools, they usually had excellent teachers.
Did you get into organic chemistry at that point?
Actually, no. First 3 years were general chemistry, and it was excellent. And then we couldn't choose the subjects or the field where we want to expand on our knowledge in chemistry. There were 8 graduating classes at the school where I went to, and they simply said from A to C that it will be food chemistry and that will be inorganic chemistry. So I became an inorganically trained chemist. But what was important is that we got excellent basics. So we could then later build on those very good basics. And I think it was a fantastic school because, as I only later realized, the knowledge which we acquired was lasting knowledge. Unlike graduates nowadays, these young people who I meet here, I discovered that even though they had basics, those basics evaporated 5 minutes after they passed the exam. And our knowledge were pretty lasting.
So how did you go from that high school to Slovak Technical University?
Well, that was also interesting. Well, I always knew my way with words because I was an avid reader. And we had a school newspaper at that high school. And I was on the editorial board of that newspaper, and as some stupid prank, we wrote some articles in that newspaper, which was not really very favorably described the staff. And that was a big no-no because discipline was very strict. So as a punishment, actually the director of the school cancelled the proms. And this was 6 months before I was supposed to graduate. And another punishment was that the editorial board, not only that they were not recommended for university, but they couldn't even apply to the university. So I was supposed to, after graduation, to go to industry, again to an assigned place, and there was no discussion about it. You had to go there. Maybe later you could change your employment, but at the beginning every graduate was assigned a place where he had to go. And the same thing was when anybody graduated from university. So, because I was not allowed to even apply to enter university, there was again a question, what am I going to do? Even though I had a place in the industry assigned, my father, through his connections, arranged that I went to work in a small city about 80 kilometers from where I grew up, into a dairy factory, because he knew somebody there. And he already prearranged that after some time that industry will recommend me to go to the university. This is how the system could be outsmarted somehow. So I entered that factory, and I was working in a quality control as a chemist, and I learned something how to make yogurts and what kind of requirements are for fats and minerals and whatever. I was in an analytical laboratory. As an organic chemist, I had some background there, and I was pretty happy there. And 3 months later, in September, there were some additional entrance exams at the university, at the Slovak Technical University, and I was already recommended by industry, so all the black marks from my past were wiped out, and I was able to enter the university. And this was a 5 years establishment, where we studied 5 years, and we took also 1 day a week military training, which allowed us, after graduation, not to have to go to military for 2 years, only for 1 year, because we had some head start, and we had some training during the university years.
So did you enroll in the university in the chemistry program?
Yes, this was a chemistry department.
Okay. Who was your mentor? Was there someone you studied with?
It worked differently than here. The system is completely different. You have your classes, no choices of subjects or classes. And you know, when I look back, actually it was not bad. I must say that the communist system screwed up many things, but not education. Education was very good. They added some nonsense, some indoctrination, but they didn't take out anything. So we had a very, very strict regimen of classes which we had to attend. We had our seminars which we had to attend. We had some preliminary exams, no multiple choice tests, which ruined every country's educational system, including the US educational system, where you have 30% of passing even if you don't open the books, right? You just guess one of the answers. Well, I can see that that's not really a good system. When we went to exams, we had to have a written exam first, and only when you passed that, you went to an oral exam where you had to coherently talk about the subjects for 20-30 minutes.
Sounds like a graduate program today.
Well, again, I haven't gone through the system here, so I don't know what the graduate program looks like.
Did you end up with a degree in wood chemistry then?
Yes, yes. Eventually, I had a choice the 3rd and 4th year that was pretty free to choose one of the subjects. And you know, again, even though I was a good student at that time, I was above average student at that time, but I still never thought about becoming a scientist. I knew that I will be working somewhere, but it never really appealed to me to become a scientist. So I graduated. I was assigned for a job in a furniture factory as a chemist, as a wood chemist. Wood, I mean, makes sense, right? It was a little bit further from my hometown, and I didn't know what to expect. So I borrowed my father's car and took my girlfriend, my present wife, and we went to explore that furniture factory. I met the manager of the lab where I was supposed to work, and he said, "Look, we don't need you here, but we cannot release you from the assignment. You have to show up." So I didn't show up because in the meantime I had to enter this military service. So I was supposed to show up after 1 year. So I did my boot camp and I started my training and everything. I hated every minute of it, really. That was not something, because there was discipline there, and that really didn't go very well with me. But I thought I will sweat it out and survive 1 year. Everything will be fine. This was 1962, winter of 1962. Those who remember those days, not many alive anymore because that was a long time ago, this was the time of Cuban crisis. And, you know, the system was very paranoid, like tomorrow somebody is going to invade us or we will have to help Cuba. So they immediately increased military service for another year, no questions asked, no exceptions. That's what I thought. And I already panicked, what am I going to do here for 2 years? Well, occasionally we could go home for a weekend, and one day I went home to my hometown and I met one of my past classmates, and we exchanged experiences from military service, and the topic of extended service for 1 more year also came up. And he said, "Haven't you heard about this little regulation which says that if you enter grad school, you don't have to serve that 1 more year?" So even though I never thought of going to a grad school, that was a pretty good incentive. And I applied. I brought some books to the barracks and did some reading, some refreshing, and I passed the exams and came next September 1, and I entered grad school at the Slovak Academy of Sciences. Again, I can thank my fate, the communist system, who first extended this for 1 year and then put a little back door how I could get out. And I really loved it.
How soon did it take to plan a thesis? When did you decide what you would study?
Well, that was again assigned. I had a degree in wood chemistry from the university, so something with wood chemistry would make sense. And I became a member of a department at the Slovak Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Chemistry, where they were studying wood polysaccharides. So I was trained in polysaccharide chemistry. And well, there were many dramatic things which happened during my grad school, but that would be too far from probably the subject which you wanted me to talk about. So I was working on my thesis, which consisted the first year only some classes, no lab work first year. We had to choose one foreign language in addition to the compulsory Russian. And I chose German. Why German? Because my hometown was only 3 kilometers from Austrian border, and I grew up on Viennese television. So I wanted to improve my German. I picked up German first from television, actually. It was a very fortunate geographical situation when in the morning we were pumped with some propaganda, but we came home in the evening, everybody opened the radio or TV, and we had the real news. And also entertainment, so I was very interested in improving my German. I started taking some English classes only about 1 year before the graduation, when I needed more to study some literature for my work. And I was doing it with a dictionary, and here and there I picked up something, of course, by reading, and the expert language is usually very simple, much easier than anything else, so I could get by, but I still was taking German as my main foreign language. And why I then started more intensely to be interested in English was because about 1 year before I was supposed to submit my thesis and started actually writing my thesis, my director called me to his office and asked me if I would consider, after getting my degree, to go for a postdoctoral training to the United States. This was 1967, when there was a political thaw in Eastern Europe. Everything became a little freer. Before that, it was unthinkable to go to the West Country, even for vacation. And this suddenly came up like a possibility, so I, of course, was very happy that I was offered that. And it was only because he knew somebody in the United States who wrote him a letter that he has a position in wood chemistry, and if the director had somebody on his staff who would be suitable for that position. So that's when I saw the vision of maybe going to the United States. I started taking private lessons in English, and I started to, read more in English, and this is how I came to the United States.
Was that Roy Whistler?
That was Roy Whistler, yes. Roy Whistler was a very good man, I think. He was very friendly from the very beginning, because he was a traveled man. So he actually visited my institute before, and that's how he became friends with my director. But other people at the university, when I showed up, they thought I was from a different planet. I was an exotic element there. Everybody thought I had maybe one more pair of eyes, and not one only, but two noses on my face when I came from a communist world.
Yeah, you're in Purdue, right?
Yes, and that's a Midwest, it's very conservative. Well, but it took maybe only a week or two, and they discovered that I am just like everybody else, except that I don't speak English so well, but otherwise they were very friendly and very helpful. I formed very good friendships, and I have corresponded with them for a very, very long time. Actually, there was a postdoc there from Japan who I still now exchange Christmas cards. And that was my best time of my life, even up to now, when I was there. The country was different, and the university was fabulous. And
so your postdoc was going to be in wood chemistry, but as
yes.
far as that was concerned, were you able to start expanding your own horizons, figuring out what you wanted to study?
Well, I was assigned my project, and I was very happy that the project was very close to what I was doing with my thesis, and because my greatest fears before I went was whether I would qualify for that job. I didn't know what to expect, what they expected of me. But because, fortunately, I was assigned a project which was very close to my thesis, I knew the equipment necessary, I knew the methodology. Of course, I encountered new things, and that was the good thing. I learned a lot, of course. But next lab, it was not wood chemistry, it was something else. That was synthetic carbohydrate chemistry.
This is still at Purdue?
Well, no longer, because Whistler is dead, and the department has some different interests.
Okay.
So I don't know very much about what's going on there, because I never visited Purdue University after that.
Okay.
But what was interesting for me and for my career is that in the next lab, there was this synthetic organic chemistry in carbohydrate chemistry done. That was being pursued. And that was very interesting times for carbohydrate chemistry, because thiosugars, which are carbohydrates where instead of oxygen in the ring there are other atoms, among them sulfur, and thiosugars were a very big thing at that time, and Whistler's lab was very big in thiosugars. Actually, they published and patented the first male contraceptive, where thioglucose was part of the drug which they tried to bring to the market, which was working already on small laboratory animals as a male contraceptive, and that was supposed to be a big thing. So they were extensively doing this chemistry. And I was just looking, and it kind of became interesting, and I made friends with Whistler's most senior postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Nayak from India, who was an excellent chemist, excellent carbohydrate chemist, an excellent teacher. And I approached him once and asked him if he would take me at night and weekends as an apprentice. And he said that I would have to ask Whistler, and Whistler didn't mind, so I spent some time with Dr. Nayak. And I became fascinated with this new field, which was completely different than polysaccharide chemistry. And I developed such liking that when I came back to Slovak Academy of Sciences, I asked my director if I could switch fields. And again, I was lucky, he let me do it.
Was this also a postdoc when you came back to Bratislava?
That I became a postdoc?
Yeah, was this another postdoc?
It was a staff position. But before I go there, let me just mention that in 1968, which was still my year at Purdue, 1968 was when the Russians came with tanks and occupied 12 million country with 600,000 troops and who knows how many tanks and airplanes and whatever. So I was in the United States, so I missed that development. And of course, all mail which I was getting from home was telling me, including my mother, don't you even think of coming back. And my mother was not really in very good health, and my family was there as hostages. So I first asked for extension of my exit visa from Czechoslovak embassy, and I got it only for 3 months. So I only could stay 3 more months. And during those 3 more months, I still could make some decisions, but all the circumstances dictated that I should go back. And as a naive young scientist, I thought that I will be the good guy, because after invasion, when I had a chance to stay, I didn't. Well, I came back, and the first 2-3 days were fine, but then I discovered that I was a CIA spy. Of course, with everything forbidden, and my life as a scientist was actually impossible to live, because in science you need communications with the rest of the world to keep abreast with everything. We had a good library, I must say. We had all books and journals available as illegal copies from China, but it was the same Journal of American Chemical Society, except the bondage was different. So we could read the literature, but we couldn't correspond with friends. We couldn't attend meetings. My first and the only international meeting I could attend was the one which was held in Czechoslovakia by some chance. So it was a very, very bad times. On the top of everything, in 1977, I suddenly got a letter from Michigan company, Upton company, pharmaceutical company, where one of the guys was establishing a second carbohydrate journal, international journal, and I got invitation from him to join the editorial board. That was something which was very unexpected. I was only about 6-7 years after getting my degree. I didn't know anybody there. They must have made that choice only because they read what we published during those years. And well, I was ecstatic, of course, but I needed a permission from the communist authorities to do that. So I was invited to a meeting of the committee of something, and they asked me why I want to be there. I said, it's not I want to be there, they chose me to be there. Well, that was again very suspicious, because probably I will have to travel, even though that didn't require any traveling. But they don't know how science worked. So my request was denied. I couldn't do it. I couldn't join the editorial board of a scientific journal. So I went to my director, who I knew was looking at my work favorably because we were productive, and I asked him what to do. I was denied. But he was a wise man, and he knew how this political system works. He said, don't answer that invitation. Because if you don't answer it, it will be assumed that you accept it. Who in the world would refuse something like that? And these guys don't read those scientific journals anyway, they will never know. So I ventured, and that's what happened.
How about
I didn't answer that letter, and when the first issue appeared, my name was there. Of course, I hid it, not to get into some hands when they would discover maybe, and it was like that until I left.
Tell me a little bit about what you were publishing. You said that you didn't have access to the cutting edge of the field, perhaps, but what kind of work were you doing in this?
Well, it had some. First, at the beginning of my career as a synthetic organic chemist, as a synthetic carbohydrate chemist, I was working on a subject which I chose myself and which I thought would be useful for the institute. When I was working on my thesis on structural research in polysaccharides, in plant polysaccharides, that required very sophisticated analytical chemistry. We had some good instruments, well, good for the Eastern Europe, but it was not quite abreast with the development in the world, but we could do very good work, I think, because if it wasn't, I wouldn't be invited. They wouldn't think by reading what we published that it's worth inviting somebody, so it must have been pretty good. And when I then came here and I realized what is going on here, we were doing some very good synthetic carbohydrate chemistry. We were synthesizing oligosaccharides, and at that time oligosaccharide chemistry was not really all that advanced, and anything before trisaccharide and tetrasaccharide was big accomplishment. And we were synthesizing pentasaccharides and hexasaccharides with very, I should say, rather primitive arsenal of chemicals. I had to actually synthesize chemicals which here cost pennies and can be ordered and delivered in 24 hours. But we didn't have foreign currency, so we couldn't order it. We had to synthesize our laboratory chemicals, some of them that is. But this made me into a better chemist. And not only that, this Eastern European world as such was a world where everything was in shortage, starting from toilet paper through sophisticated chemicals. So we were forced to improvise. When we didn't have what we needed, we figured out how to do it without the necessities. And it comes handy even here sometimes. So that was maybe one reason why people who come here, scientists, and stay here, they usually succeed. And I myself consider myself an American success, because I came here with a suitcase of dirty underwear, and here I am, a section chief of the oldest carbohydrate group in the whole world. I must say that I didn't do so poorly.
Tell me about what you talk about that you were doing the synthesis.
Oh yes, I digressed a little.
I want to get a little bit of what the goal was.
Yes,
to
yes.
go through all these different syntheses.
Yes, for this polysaccharide chemistry, using the limited arsenal of instruments, we needed standard materials, standard chemicals, standard derivatives of carbohydrates, and those were not available. Only when somebody went abroad and was gifted some of these very precious materials, these were methylated sugars needed for methylation analysis of polysaccharides to elucidate the structure. So these methylated sugars were in great demand and were not easy to get. So my first big project was to synthesize series of model compounds, methylated sugars, for this structural research. And then later I started again synthesizing model compounds for polysaccharide chemists, but not methylated sugars, but oligosaccharides. I synthesized these oligosaccharides as structural units of structure of plant polysaccharides. Xylans, galactans, glucans. Other people were working on these structures and they needed it, and that's why the Institute supported this kind of work, because it was useful for other people at the Institute.
You were making the building blocks.
Yes, I was making these building blocks. And it was a very good training in the manipulation of structures of carbohydrates and transferring one to the other and making all sorts of useful derivatives, which tremendously helped me when I came here. So we synthesized and published syntheses of these very sophisticated structures, and this drew attention of the carbohydrate words to our work. And I remember in 1974, when there was this international meeting held in Czechoslovakia, many people who came from US and Europe and elsewhere, they came to see me because they knew our work. I was so flattered, I mean. And I formed also some very good friendships from those days with foreign scientists.
You were still a pretty young scientist yourself at that point.
Well, yes, I was 35, 37. I came here, I was already 41. 43 when I came here. So that was something which everybody was very surprised back home when they learned that at this age I ventured to emigrate illegally and start completely new life. I was surprised myself, but they made my life so miserable. Again, I thank the communist regime that I am here, because had they not made my life so miserable over there, I would never think about coming here.
So in a sort of thumbnail sketch, how did you get here? Tell me about the decision and how you ended up. I guess it was in California, right?
The decision, yes, I landed in California, but before I landed in California, I, again, because I was not allowed to travel anywhere, and my life as a scientist was kind of limited a little bit by that, I decided that I will use my first opportunity and I will try to emigrate. I didn't really know exactly where, but my first choice was United States because I was already here once. So I knew the system, I spoke reasonable English, and that was my first country of choice. My wife has two sisters in Austria, married to Austrians. So we were allowed to visit. And we visited and never came back. And actually we didn't even leave the country, all three of us together, because that would be maybe suspicious. So we didn't even leave through the same border crossing. My wife stayed behind for a week or two, and I with my son left, and then later she crossed the border again legally with her exit visa valid for 3 weeks as ours, through a different border crossing, and that was time before computers, so things didn't match up, and that's how we were able to leave and not get caught or shot at the border. So we didn't really literally jump the fence, but we left illegally. And then we approached a refugee organization in Austria, and they sent us for 3 weeks to a sort of a camp in Italy. And because I had a second cousin in the United States, we got affidavit of support, and that it happened so that we spent in that refugee camp only for 6 weeks, unlike some people who stayed there for a year or two even, because if you don't have a sponsor, it's not so easy.
What year was this?
1981.
So you flew to the United States then?
I flew to the United States. I got a loan, an interest-free loan. So I paid these 3 tickets, took me about 2 or 3 years, but I paid every penny of it. And when we landed, I didn't get 1 penny of government support, because for those first few weeks I stayed with my cousin, and I found employment in California with a small chemical company, Bachem Incorporated in Torrance, where I was assigned the work to establish a new product line I was a carbohydrate chemist, and nucleotides and nucleosides are partially carbohydrates. So that's why I was considered for employment, but I never even touched or synthesized or read much about nucleosides, so I was a little scared. And but they were very nice, and they sent me for some initial training in this kind of chemistry to City of Hope in Duarte, California. There was a big research institute where they were doing this kind of work. So I was commuting like 70 miles from Los Angeles to Duarte, and I joined a group for some time which was involved in oligonucleotides and oligonucleosides. But I was familiar with the chemistry, and everything went very well. So after 3 months, I started working in the lab, which was actually an empty room. I had to order all the equipment and establish the lab. I got one technician working with me, and we started doing essentially the same work as I was doing in Duarte, California. But to scale up this chemistry took much more than taking a bigger pot, and we were sweating blood. It was very difficult. I was a little arrogant, and I thought that when I can make oligosaccharides, which is not easy chemistry, I can do anything. That was not like that. Thousands of dollars went down the drain before we developed our own system to do this kind of chemistry on a large scale.
Now, why did Bauckham want the large quantities of oligosaccharides?
That was a new field. Machine synthesis of DNA was just started. And there was one company, I don't remember now the name of the company, who was making this, and they were the second company who wanted to get into this field. And when we eventually learned how to really make these compounds on a large scale, they were making tons of money, because these compounds are needed for research in milligram quantities. And we were making these 30 grams a day. And they were selling them $1,000 a gram. So 2 people, 1 technician and 1 PhD, were making these monies. And we were, I must say, we were pretty exploited, because the whole company was about 30 people, including janitors. And we were, I was a little naive, and when I was hired, the boss asked me, so how much do you think you are worth? And I said, I don't know. Because I knew how much people were making years back when I was here. So I know that it was 81. Inflation in the meantime changed the buying value of $1, but I was making $25,000 a year in industry, making all these monies for the company. But I could survive, so I was happy, because I wanted to survive at the beginning, first of all. Right? Yes. So, and it went like this until I left Bauckham. And I was not really happy, because it was, once I learned how to do this, it was a very monotonous work. There were 64 compounds which we were supposed to make, every day a different compound, but it was same recipe, everything was done the same way. This is not what I used to do. I used to do every day something else.
So did you think about going to universities, things like that? Tell me how NIH, and I guess it was NIDDK at the time.
Yes.
How did that come to your attention or become a prospect?
Well, Bachem made a mistake. They sent me for a meeting in Vancouver, Canada, to an international carbohydrate meeting to promote their products, which I did, and I maybe generated some business. But during that 1 week, I met my former boss from NIH, Dr. Glaudemans, who I knew his work from before because he also was trained as a wood chemist first in Canada at McGill. And actually I remember his major advisor, Dr. Timmel from McGill, came to visit our institute in Bratislava once. And because that was wood chemistry, I was assigned to go with him as a guide around the town, driving him to the institute. So I learned him, and then I made acquaintance, and I knew his work with Glaudemans. So when I found out that Glaudemans was at the meeting, I tried to approach him, and I did. And I had some friends from before who knew him. The editor at that time of the journal where I was on the board was also there.
What was the name of the journal?
Journal of Carbohydrates, Nucleotides, and Nucleosides, which no longer exists. This is the journal. See? This is the first issue.
Okay.
Issue 1. And if you can see it, my name must be there somewhere. Is it? Right here.
There it is. Slovak Academy of Science.
Yes, it was in 1970 something, 1974. See? And that journal no longer exists.
So you had some connections.
Yes, and that
Going to
helped
this
me,
conference.
Of course.
And you talked to Dr. Glaudemans?
I talked to Dr. Glaudemans. Dr. Glaudemans didn't promise anything. He said that he will explore possibilities because I was already established. I was not a beginning graduate who would be suitable for a postdoctoral position. And few weeks later, I got a letter from him. That was in September. And January, I was already here, following year, as a visiting scientist first.
What was Dr. Glaudemans working on?
He was a very good immunochemist. He was studying immunoglobulins on a very theoretical basis that was no translational research, that was basic research. And he, in his study, needed oligosaccharides. So, and he also knew my work in this wood chemistry, because he was a wood chemist. So it was a very good connection, and he was very, positive about hiring me. He just didn't know how at that time at the symposium. But then he offered me a position as a visiting scientist. And this is how I started here, working with him on this basic immunochemistry, but I was the person who didn't do the immunology work. I was synthesizing these very strange structures, fluorosugars, deoxysugars, which he needed for mapping the subsites of combining area of immunoglobulins with antigens.
He's doing vaccine work.
He was no. He was not doing vaccine work. He was doing basic immunology,
Right.
but not translational. And we were very successful, and I liked the work very much, and it was work which I could do. I was cranking out these sugars, He was amazed, and I was amazed, because I didn't do fluorosugars before. I didn't do deoxysugars before. But this was actually not so difficult. Once you studied some literature, you first just repeated the protocols which somebody else did, and then as you work, then you improve on things. So we published really extensively, and this also probably put me on the map around here. Glaudemans always emphasized, don't even think about getting a permanent position here. And I accepted it, but I was doing still everything toward that goal. And when he was thinking about retiring, which was about 3 years before he actually retired, wait a minute, how was this? No, actually, I became permanent before that. Yes, I became permanent when I got my citizenship in 1986, which was 5 years after he came here. But I was already considered for that. I was only waiting for my citizenship.
And all these publications didn't hurt at all.
Oh, they helped tremendously, tremendously.
So you published more than usual. What kind of publication rate are we talking about? How many papers a year were you?
I was having like 10 papers a year, because this was a new area where I could apply my ideas from before. New methodology. Also, I knew how to improvise, so even I was making compounds which required something which I didn't have to buy. I knew that the budget was very tight, and I surprised Neil Glaudemans when I brought him something, because he knew that I needed something for that, and he never had to order it. So my improvisation ability, which again the communist system taught me, was helpful again. And some people came for advice, and people came for compounds. I collaborated with some people around already at that time. So, as I said, I was very productive, I must say, and this is what gave me the position, because he knew that I can be useful. So when he was thinking about retiring, I knew that I will be here now, probably taking over the section, and I didn't know much about immunology, so I had to learn immunology. I was a chemist, and I knew that I will not be able to survive with just making compounds. So I told Dr. Glaudemans that we should be engaged in something more practical. I wanted to change the line of work here so that it will help me survive here. And I was interested in this immunology, of course, because I found it interesting, and during me making compounds for immunology, I was doing a lot of reading about immunology, and this somehow initiated my interest in these things. Dr. Glaudemans was a genius. I think he was a genius. He was so versatile. He knew so many things. And even outside of chemistry and immunology, he was a great violin player. He was a great painter. He painted like, if I didn't know that these were his painting, I would think it was some professional painter. He was very talented, and he was a very good scientist. But through his violin playing, he knew a scientist at another institute in Building 6, Dr. Schneerson, who was also a violin player, and they played in some orchestra together, and she was an immunologist, and they were working on vaccines. So this is how first Dr. Glaudemans established this collaboration with Building 6. And I also started working more on real vaccines, making still oligosaccharides, but for antigens to imitate antigens which were involved in real diseases. This is how we first started working on shigella dysentery type 1, and we published on mapping again, combining areas of immunoglobulins involved in that disease, and that was also very successful.
So this into the 1980s here, early 90s?
Yes, this was late 80s, early 90s.
Is this the glycoconjugate?
It was still not glycoconjugate, but it was targeted towards that. We were still trying only to find out how these polysaccharides bind to their immunoglobulins, to their homologous immunoglobulins. So we were making smaller and larger molecules as far as chemistry allowed, because carbohydrate chemistry still has limited possibilities making defined and well characterized large oligosaccharides. There was another chemist involved in this because it was a very, very large load of work with these shigella oligosaccharides, and in building 6 there was no chemical lab, so Dr. Schneerson with Dr. Robbins, who was a lab chief, they hired a chemist who was working in our laboratories. He was officially employed with their institute, NICHD, Child and Development. But he was working here, and then later they built a chemical laboratory for this person, and he moved to building 6, and he took Shigella project with him. So I was kind of in a limbo, and I asked Dr. Robbins to think about another important disease where I could have my own project, and he gave me some choices. And Vibrio cholera and cholera disease I chose because it was chemically very challenging and very interesting, and still useful for medical field, because it was a real disease. Even though United States, here it is not really very important, but thousands and thousands of people around the world die of the disease. And even though some vaccines are now commercially available, but not really all that effective, because they have very long, they don't have very long protection. So cholera is still a problem, and a good vaccine is still an issue which needs attention, and that's why we still work on it.
And you talked about how Vibrio cholera itself is complicated. That was a challenge.
It was a challenge because the chemistry is complicated. The structure is, even though the structure is only a repeating unit of a monosaccharide, but that monosaccharide is 12 chemistry steps to make from a commercially available material. And it is a very complicated monosaccharide. It's a complicated structure. So even the monosaccharide, making the monosaccharide is not so easy.
Did you have to come up with the 12 steps? Is that your challenge?
Well, not the whole 12 steps, because that monosaccharide was synthesized before, but in a very cumbersome way, and we improved on it. And then we started making oligosaccharides. Only a disaccharide was known at that time. And we made 12 sugars together, dodecasaccharides. So it was a good work. And later, circumstances somehow made it that we no longer collaborated with Building 6, but Dartmouth Medical School had a physician who was interested in cholera, and he actually found us.
Dartmouth?
Dartmouth, yes.
Who was that? Do you know?
Dr. Wade.
Okay.
Dr. Wade. He is a very good vaccine person, and he discovered through the literature that we make these sugars. And with him, we made first glycoconjugates. And they tested it, and they first found that the hexasaccharide, when conjugated to proteins, confer protection in mice.
Give us the layman's definition of the glycoconjugate. It was in there, but if you could...
Yes, well, glycoconjugate is any substance where a sugar is attached to it chemically, not necessarily a vaccine, anything. It's a general term. When we make vaccines, we actually don't make glycoconjugates, we make neoglycoconjugates. Glycoconjugates are usually natural products, but when man is involved, when it's man-made, should I say person-made?
We'll take man-made for now.
Then it becomes neoglycoconjugate. And these neoglycoconjugates can be made from synthetic carbohydrates or from bacterial polysaccharides. Polysaccharides happen to be on the surface of gram-negative bacteria, and they are part of lipopolysaccharides. And when used as vaccines, they can confer protection. There are some neoglycoconjugate vaccine already available on the market, and they are sometimes very expensive because they are usually made by first isolating these polysaccharides from bacteria. They have to be purified, and then in order to conjugate them, these are large molecules, and proteins to which they are normally conjugated are also large molecules. And it is believed that these two large molecules cannot really react unless we do something to make them reactive and still stay far away from one another, so that there is no steric hindrance which would prevent them to combine. So what is normally done is that both the polysaccharide and the protein are further reacted and further modified by attachment of some linking molecules, so that these long chains keep these big molecules apart and only the small chains react together. But this is very costly, because when you make this derivatization and attachment of linker to either of these components, you end up with a mixture of chemicals, and you have to dig out these pure compounds which you then conjugate.
So you want to synthesize this? Is that
you have to synthesize that, and then you have to purify it. This is all labor intensive and costly. And this is how even today vaccines are made. That's one thing. Second, which is very common in vaccine production, is that these neoglycoconjugates are very poorly characterized, because they are conjugated in such a way that at the end the vaccine is a very large cross-linked molecule, and because it is very large and cross-linked, it is very difficult to characterize it. So they are purified and they are characterized to a certain extent, but many times we don't really know exactly what the structure is. We are happy that it works as a vaccine, not that we don't care what the structure is, but we don't have means to really determine it. Now, during our work on these vaccines, we didn't want to really make these poorly characterized molecules, because we are chemists and we like to know what we work with. And there is a method which can make well-defined neoglycoconjugates from small molecules, from the synthetic oligosaccharides. And this is what I was doing with Dr. Wade. We were making these oligosaccharides, conjugating them in a special way using a chemistry which is called squaric acid chemistry, because this chemistry make non-cross-linked big molecules. This method was invented in Germany in the early 90s, and it was working and have been used since then for making all sorts of glycoconjugates or non-glycoconjugates, because the method was developed to actually conjugate two amines together. And we were using it for making glycoconjugates because when we attached this linker to an oligosaccharide, and when the linker we modified to contain an amino group, these other amino groups are in proteins. Proteins are full of amino groups. So we were able to then conjugate protein which has many amino groups with carbohydrate which had only one amino group. So these molecules, when they react, they cannot cross-link. So these molecules then are star-shaped. There is a big protein molecule, and then rays of carbohydrates with the linkers are shooting out. So this becomes a glycoconjugate because sugars are there, but not cross-linked, poorly characterized, but we can really very exactly characterize what those molecules are. Well, these years went by and we were making all sorts of glycoconjugates from these oligosaccharides, not only for cholera, also for anthrax and for some other diseases. And then I don't know really how I simply got an idea that we should try maybe this very potent squaric acid chemistry also for bacterial polysaccharides, but without linker. So it was just a wild idea and it worked.
Do you remember when the wild idea came to you?
Well, we could find it from where our first paper on this was published. I think it was maybe 2004 or 5, something like that. Well, actually, no. It was later, 2009, I think, when the polysaccharides, squaric acid and oligosaccharide we were doing before. But with this polysaccharide, it must have been later, because the first person who synthesized that in my lab was Dr. Shu. And he came only, or even later, 2001 probably. Yes. And this is a very successful method. And when they found that it not only works, but when already Harvard University, where we in the meantime established collaboration with Dr. Ryan at Harvard Medical School, they also confirmed everything first what we did with Dr. Wade. So that's very important that you can reproduce your results and that independent lab can confirm what you did with somebody else. So that was sort of a proof of the usefulness of this method. So then later we also did these neoglycoconjugates from bacterial polysaccharide, which Harvard University prepared for us. They isolated. We are not equipped to work with infectious bacteria. So they do, because you need to you cultivate first and grow bacteria in large amount and then kill them and extract and whatever. we are a chemical lab, so we don't do that. But they were able to do it for us, and they gave us the polysaccharide, which is no longer infective. And we further purified it and then made glycoconjugates from it. And when it became known that this is going to work, then I tried to patent this with NIH. Well, I must say, to my disappointment, NIH was not interested. And they told me, do whatever you want. They gave me actually a permission to file for a patent as a private person. Well, I didn't do that. I told about this to Harvard University, who were ecstatic, and they immediately jumped at it, and that's how we have patent, with, of course, with NIH's participation, except that the first patent holders are them. And this is how this very successful collaboration is going on still.
Are you to the trials stage, or where?
Well, this is all a matter of money, of course. And the government spent $2 million and hired an outside contractor, a biotechnology company, Paragon, in Baltimore somewhere, who ran this making of this vaccine, including growing these bacteria on large scale. They took that protocol from Harvard and the conjugation protocol from us, and they proved not only the reproducibility of our protocol, but scalability, because this is what is important. As I learned at Bachem, it doesn't take only taking a bigger pot in order for something to work on a large scale. So they had to go through some explorations, but they were able to scale up and made a big batch. And because of shortage of money, it never went further to prepare a batch on GMP conditions so that it can be used then also for some clinical trials, first for toxicology, and then through the whole process how a vaccine is approved eventually by FDA. But all the basics are here, so it's really only a matter of money.
Is this the cholera vaccine?
This is the cholera vaccine. But in the meantime, we don't do much more exploratory, but not much more exploratory work on cholera. We are now going into salmonella and shigella and some other.
Back to shigella.
Back to, but different strain. And before that, we also were working on anthrax, because when anthrax became potentially a biological weapon, then it was again a chancy situation how we got into that. It happened so that an immunologist from California came to NIH to meet somebody who knew his former advisor, late Dr. Kovac. Dr. Kovac was a very prominent immunologist who I knew through Dr. Glaudemans, and we also published together. So when Dr. Wang from California came to look for somebody who might have known Dr. Kovac, he came to me because he knew that I was in an immunology lab and that we published with Kovac. So he came to visit, and we had lunch together, and we talked about the weather and other things. And at that point, he said that he was looking for some collaborators who could synthesize for him the anthrax spore antigen. Anthrax carbohydrate, which is on surface of anthrax spores. Well, I didn't know anything about anthrax spores, but when he showed me the structure, I saw that we can synthesize it actually. And so we did. And we were the first people who synthesized a novel sugar anthros, who is the terminal determinant of an oligosaccharide which is on anthrax spores. And we made also conjugates, and we made with Dr. Wang and also with other people in the world some very important diagnostic tools to detect and presence of anthrax spores. We never really got into making a vaccine because in order to work with live spores, you need special laboratories and special equipment, and our hands were full enough. We were proud that we made anthros for the first time. You know, everybody wants to be number one in something. So I have anthros on my license plate.
You've been talking a lot about some of the partners you've worked with, Dartmouth, Harvard. You work with an external partner on the anthrax.
Yes, that was in Germany with an institute which is an immunology institute, Robert Koch Institute in Germany. And they were able to make, using our sugars, monoclonal antibodies for anthrax spores, and for some compounds on anthrax spores, on some proteins on anthrax spores. And there was a publication from it, and they were very happy.
How does the process work? Do you just sort of give them your paper, talk to them, and say, "Here you go, have at it," or do you have to?
They usually find it. They usually find it. This is how first Dr. Wade found us. Through Dr. Wade, I became quite friends with Dr. Ryan. And these people in Germany, as some other people in Australia, Japan, and around the world, they usually find papers which are related in one way or another with their own work. And if they feel that our chemistry can help, or maybe already have a compound ready for them because we have synthesized them, well, I make sure that every compound which we synthesize is still that we have it in very small amount as some standard compound, or sometimes in a larger amount, and sometimes we send them. This is simply ethics of the field, that if a colleague needs something, then we send them, that we don't ask for anything. Besides, this was made with public money, so we cannot sell it, but they usually appreciate it, and then we collaborate, and we participate on papers they publish. So this is a common thing. Nowadays, science became so complicated that unlike maybe 50 years ago, you hardly ever see a paper with a single author. It's always at least 5, 6, even 20, 30 authors, because this is all multidisciplinary approach. Some people are almost like encyclopedia, but they still cannot go and work on a project from the beginning to the end and bring it to some conclusions themselves. They have to have people from many different branches of science collaborating.
Let's switch tracks a little bit. Dr. Glaudemans told you that don't expect to stay here at one point, but then when he decides to retire, you stepped in behind him. Tell me a little bit about the process.
I really don't know how it happened. Eventually,
did he sort of train you and get you up to speed on how the lab worked?
No, that's already. Well, I've been with him 5 years before that, so I kept my eyes open, and everybody has his own method. But I adopted some of his ideas how to be a mentor to some young people and how to keep section going. this is a very small group. It has always been a small group during my time. I remember that the group used to be much larger during previous management. I don't know how it happened that it shrunk almost every year, but when I started we were 4 people, 3 postdoctoral fellows and myself. So because it is a very small group and I tend to be in very close contact, I talk to them every day, to every one of them, so I can, group is small enough for me to be able to keep track on everything, whoever works on what, and at what stage the work is. I still, even though I sometimes forget what I had for dinner last night, I remember still everything what's going on in the lab.
How about the section? Do you have to deal with the higher ups on a regular basis?
Not really, not much, fortunately. So I don't have really many administrative duties, but I have a lot of editorial duties, because over the years I became a very frequent peer reviewer of scientific papers in my field. I am also on editorial board of some journals, and I have started my own series of books on synthetic carbohydrate chemistry. And volume number 5 is now in production. 4 volumes are already out, and it is very successful. I like doing it, and it keeps me freshly informed about new developments, which helps also.
That sounds like it would be a big job. You must be talking to a lot of people, a lot of authors.
Well, I was involved as a sole person in volume number 1 because I didn't know how much work it was. But then when I discovered how much work it was, then I always have a volume editor or volume editors. I am the managing editor, so everything has to go through me. But I am not involved in recruiting contributors. They have to write the letters, they have to initially evaluate whether any contribution is suitable or not, and then only then it gets to my hands when I have to read it and decide how much it had to be pruned, because people usually don't realize that these chapters in the book are meant to be just dry protocol of making something. There is always, of course, some background introduction, but it's usually not more than a half page. And I usually have to mark paragraphs which have to be taken out, because it is not the purpose really to give a review on something, it's only to give some reliable, reproducible protocol where properly characterized compounds and their preparation are described. So it's not like a normal publication, and usually it is not a publication which is for the authors important that it comes out very quickly, because a preparation of a volume takes 2 years. So if somebody wants to publish something quickly because it's some sort of almost a discovery, then they don't send it to us, they send it to some other journal. But yes, it is a lot of work, because every next volume is more difficult to put together than the previous volume, because usually important things which are generally useful have already been published, and only limited number of such generally useful things are new in the literature. So it took me maybe 1.5 years to put through the production from the very beginning to publication volume 1. But I remember volume 4 took almost 3 years to publish.
It's probably getting more specialized as you go along, I suppose.
Well, not really, because we want to cover compounds which are useful in glycosciences in many many different branches of carbohydrates chemistry. And when glycobiology comes into this, then more different compounds, differently modified carbohydrates are needed. But still, first volume was probably most easy to fill with relevant material than volume 5, which is just about to be submitted, but still it's not out. And I already have lined up volume editors for volume 6, even though they haven't even started inviting people, because I find that it would be not good if 2 volumes overlapped by inviting, so I wait until we close accepting papers for volume 5, and then I can give green light to editors of volume 6 to start their invitation, sending out their invitations.
So I want to talk a little bit about what I ran across in a number of venues, which was your open letter to the community of organic chemists, which is made for fun reading.
Well,
I'd just like to talk a little bit about
okay.
sort of where your thoughts came, when you started developing those ideas and the reception.
Well, the idea, writing something about the topic, is a result of meeting colleagues in the field at various meetings during coffee breaks, when we talk about many things, and also where carbohydrate chemistry is going and what is the state of the field. And we almost unanimously agree that there is a crisis, not only in executing and publishing carbohydrate chemistry, but the whole field of organic chemistry. Because it seems, well, actually it is the truth, because otherwise there would be not so much and so much agreement that we have a crisis, that the more sophisticated instrumentation we have and the more new useful chemicals we have to do our work, at the same time the science level of huge number of papers goes down, because everybody wants to do it very quickly, everybody is struggling for funds. So if you don't publish quickly and don't publish a lot, publish or perish. And unfortunately it has very negative effect on the quality of work. People are worshipping high impact factor journals. I call these journals new golden calf, because not only, well, authors are sort of forced to do that because they know that reviewers are not looking at the content of the paper, but which journal is it and in which journal people published before. And they judge competence and ability of young people by where they published before, which is really not very wise. Because young people cannot start publishing in some fancy journals, even when they are talented and have good ideas. And it happens so then that young people struggle for funds, which is sucked up by established individuals who then get many times, I don't want to generalize, many times get funds to produce more sub-quality work. We at NIH are very fortunate that we don't have to write grants, and on the other hand, resources are spent well, because we are a bunch of self-motivated people who very much appreciate that we are allocated the funds and we don't have to spend time writing proposals, and we can fully devote our time and extra time to do research. And we do that. When you come to NIH Saturday or Sunday, 70% or 50% of parking lots are filled up. And these are not filled up by bureaucrats. These are filled up by scientists. So no question whether we are motivated or whether we love our work or not. And this is probably the best policeman, that we are interested in doing things and also guarding things. We want to be number one, and we don't want somebody to take advantage of us. So they don't have to be so nervous that we are going to disclose something which we should not, because we are interested in preserving the priority of our research. And this is across the board, not only the old generation, the young generation also. And we have very many very talented young people who also spend time here. I had a postdoc who came to check their reaction at midnight. And it was not forced labor. She was interested how things are going.
Speaking of these younger scientists, you're sort of handing things off in your field to another generation. You've been doing that for a while. Where do you see carbohydrate chemistry going, and the work that your lab is doing in particular? Do you see new directions, new specialties?
Well, of course, every field has its goals, and it is good that carbohydrates are so heavily involved in the life sciences. So we have always tons of things to do, and there will always be need for a pair of good chemists' hands, because our products are needed in such a wide spectrum of fields in the life sciences. It's not only vaccines. Carbohydrates are omnipresent in the life sciences. Wherever, even in drug field, some useful drugs have carbohydrates as a constituent, so they are glycoconjugates, except not in vaccines, but for other things. Where the field is going, the field is going the right direction, except that, as I mentioned many times, we see that these materials which are synthesized are not always well characterized, well purified. Journals are accepting these works because somehow the publishing has taken over the science. There are every day almost a new journal is appearing, because the publishing industry found that money can be made by selling journals. Now, when the number of journals increases, these pages have to be filled with something. When they have to be filled, then the level of science has to be decreased. Otherwise, those pages would not be possible to fill. On the top of everything, with more papers, there is a need for qualified reviewers, and there is not enough qualified proofreaders, reviewers, to read everything carefully. When I get a paper to review, it takes me several days to do this. I have to do to the library. Even though my library is on my computer, on my desk, I still have to go there, do it. I was removed from the editorial board of one journal because I was rejecting too many papers. I found it a compliment, actually. But that happens also. because these publishers don't want you to reject the paper, because they need something else to publish. And this is not only chemistry. The life sciences in general. Actually, there was a paper published in Nature by the director and the deputy director of NIH when they pointed to the fact that there is not everything reproducible also in those fields, and that it cannot go on like that forever. So we have to forget about high impact journals and age journals. Actually, I think that the metrics for the quality of science is not in age factors and impact factors, but the best factor is collected during meetings, during coffee breaks, how individual scientists are talking among themselves about certain scientists. Then you hear the truth, whether they appreciate and respect some other scientists or whether they badmouth them. That is the objective criterion, not the impact factor. Impact factor. Why would we put some value on the journal and not on the person who wrote that paper? Does anybody know where Einstein published his work? We value him and not the journal where he published things. I think that it's a little bit misguided, you know.
So you've had a chance to maintain a personal relationship with everybody in your lab for
yes, for a long time. Sometimes
I get a sense that's how you mentor. It's just by working with people at the bench. Is that right?
Yes, I talk to them every day, and I admit I don't do lab work per se. I sometimes do this or that or show them something, but I don't have my personal project. But I talk to them, and we have also occasional journal clubs, because always somebody comes up with something, so we discuss it. But we don't have actually regular lab meetings, because I don't think it's necessary with such a small group when everybody knows what everybody is doing, and I talk to them every day. And I don't breathe at their necks. I give considerable freedom, and this is what I learned actually from Dr. Glaudemans. He always said that putting pressure on people is a prescription for cheating. And I never done that, and actually two of the three postdocs come at 10. But they leave maybe at 8 o'clock at night, so why would I care when they come? Everybody has a different system how they work. I'm an early bird, but somebody else wants to stay long at home or do something and then comes later. I really don't make a big fuss about it. I know that they produce, I know that they do their job properly, and that's what counts.
Is all the work in vaccine related at this
Yes,
point?
yes.
And you see it being that way in the near future?
That's a very touchy subject too. And I am going to step on a very dangerous ground. Actually, not because I'm 2 weeks before retirement, but I retire, this section ceases to exist. Unfortunately, I must say, unlike years back when I was hired with the intention of the institute that the group should continue. I don't complain about NIDDK or the lab, because they have always, either on the lab level or on the institute level, we have been always, our work has been supported, and I have no complaints about that. But I still think that an institution like NIH deserves a small group with the expertise in carbohydrate chemistry, because carbohydrates are important in the life sciences. And our operation is very inexpensive. Aside from salaries, our yearly budget is $70,000. With the billions of dollars which are invested in the NIH, this is a drop in a big bucket. And actually, by dissolving this group, I cannot look at it in any different way as wasting of resources which have been invested in this group. So it's not, I don't want to keep it as a nostalgia, because this is 100 years or more old group, which is a nice history, and this is a history which contributed to the good name of NIH long before the DNA was cracked here, structure. So, but I don't mean the merit from the past. I mean the scientific counselors who evaluate us every 4 years, their reports have always been very positive. And I remember that one of the reports ended when they were talking about budget, that the resources of this group should be maintained or increased. Despite of that, 2019 came, and this group is no longer going to exist.
Well, you can take solace in the work that you have done.
Well, yes, of course. And all my wild dreams as far as my professional life have been fulfilled here because, as I said, the Institute has supported our work. I have learned a lot in the process. I met fantastic people around NIH. This is full of brains when I am just a little nut somewhere, but this is an excellent and very precious institution. This is a national treasure.
And this has been a great story. I really
Thank you.
appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.